but we're going to be taking a look at the maximum and minimum widths and heights a bit later on anyway. Okay, so for the rest of the options, I'm going to remove the bigger box just so we can see everything a bit better. So I'm going to get rid of the bigger box from here, and now again we're just left with the smaller box that we can still resize. So let's go ahead and take a look at some of the other options that we can define in here. Now the first one we're going to look at is animate, and we can set this to either true or false. By default it's false. So what's going to happen here is when we drag, we don't actually see the drag happen, but when we release, it resizes to the size that you've defined. Now there is a problem here that you can't actually see where you're dragging to. So I could, drag over here and it'll animate nicely, but we can't actually see where we are actually dragging it to before it animates. So to fix this, we use the ghost option, and by default this is set to false, but now we're going to set it to true. We'll actually see a lower opacity version of the div that you are, or the element that you are resizing before the animation happens. So you can see that at the moment I'm dragging that there. You can see the opacity set much lower, and then that will resize to a particular area, so you can see the ghost of the div or the element before you actually decide to drag it, or before the user actually drags it. With regards to the animation, we can set a few different properties here. So for example, we could set animate duration, and this just is the speed of the animation in milliseconds. We can also specify things like slow, medium and fast, or sorry, not medium, normal and fast. So for example, if we were to set the animation duration to slow, when we go ahead and resize it, well, that's classed as slow. If we were to go ahead and change this to fast, you can see that you have a much faster effect when it resizes, so it's quite quicker. Or you can go ahead, like I said, and define this in milliseconds. So we could say 50, for example, which would be extremely quick, and when we resize, it almost snaps to it. So depending on what kind of effect you're looking for, you can do this. Obviously, if we would go up to something like 3 seconds, which is 3000 milliseconds, you can see it slides a lot quicker, slower, sorry. And with regards to animation as well, we can use animation easing techniques. So we can also define animate easing, and you can set it to, by default it's set to swing, but you can set it to linear. So let's just check out swing. That's the default option. You can see, particularly when it's very slow, that as it gets towards the end it slows down. So it's almost like a graph that starts low. So when the animation starts, it starts slowly, it speeds up, and then it slows down again. This is the swing animation easing effect. If we were to use linear, it will resize at exactly the same speed every time. You can see then it just stops. So depending on, again, how you want it to look, this will just slide at a constant pace as opposed to swing. So I'm just going to remove this animation duration and remove this animate easing so we can see some other options. Now another useful option is the aspect ratio. If you're trying to maintain a particular aspect ratio, you can go ahead and turn this on. So for example, if I was just to say true, what will happen now is I can't resize out of the actual aspect ratio, the original aspect ratio of the object or the element. So now that I've set this to true, I can't actually move it. For example, I can't resize from the sides. The aspect ratio is maintained. But however, with the aspect ratio, you can also predefine an aspect ratio that you want it to adhere to. So for example, you could do this in a point something form. So for example 0.40, this would just keep it in this aspect ratio here, and then now that object is bound to that particular aspect ratio. You can also define a fraction, for example 2/5 or 2/5, and this would also allow you to do this. So for example, you could do 9/10, and then this would keep a 9/10 aspect ratio, so it's 9 width and 10 height. So that's the aspect ratio. Just keeping it to true though will maintain the initial aspect ratio that it holds. So let's go ahead and get rid of that. Okay, so back onto a more aesthetic option, we're going to go ahead and enable auto hide. Now what auto hide does is it hides the tiny triangle that you can see in the corner of this div until the mouse is hovered over the element in which you are resizing. So if we were to set auto hide to true and we refresh, you can see that the triangle has actually disappeared. However, when I hover my mouse over this particular element, the small triangle appears again. So I can now go ahead and resize this. So that's quite useful if you don't want to show this on, let's say you had a lot of resizable objects, you don't want to show this on every single object. And if it's obvious that a particular element can be resized, you might not want to show this. However, be careful, because if you don't show this initially, it does just look like a grey box. The small triangle in the corner often represents something that can be resized. So it's entirely up to you on whether you were to keep it there. I like to keep auto hide off generally, but again, if you had lots of elements that are able to be resized, it tends to look better when you enable auto hide. Okay, so another thing we can do is we can specify a grid. Now we saw this in the draggable interaction in the jQuery UI as well, and with the grid we can specify a numerical value or two numerical values within square brackets that represent a grid that the element will snap to.